Hey there! In today's video we are going to take a closer look at the performance of the ROG Ally with, in this case, the AMD Z1 Extreme CPU. And we're going to test it in over 30 games and some work-related benchmarks at the end of the video as well. This one is not going to be a regular review of the ASUS ROG Ally, but a longer benchmark test instead. All games have been recorded with a capture card on a separate PC, so there is no performance loss in the recordings. Except in some videos, unfortunately there is. But let me explain first. In the beginning I had the annoying issue that attaching the capture card via HDMI using this 7-in-1 dock by JSOX for the ROG Ally resulted in a pretty noticeable performance drop of around 10 to 15%. So I actually measured the first games without recording them and then just recorded a bit of gameplay afterwards. But after a while I finally figured out what the issue was. So if you ever use an external monitor for the Ally, make sure that AMD RSR is turned off in the overlay menu, as it can obviously affect the performance in some scenarios on external displays, unless they fix that in a BIOS update soon. Okay, and all games in this video have been benchmarked with the Ally being plugged in and using the 30-watt turbo mode to make sure I was getting the maximum performance. Of course, on battery it will be quite a bit slower in many games when using the 25-watt turbo mode, and using the 15-watt performance mode on battery will further reduce the performance. To give you a quick idea of the differences, I've tested all of these combinations in the benchmarks of Cyberpunk 2077 and Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and as you can see, the results of the average FPS right here. And actually in Cyberpunk the difference was quite big, but in Shadow of the Tomb Raider it wasn't, so it really depends on the game. Another thing that I have to point out is that some of the recordings look a bit stuttery, which is due to the recording card, so I could prevent too much input lag. I have to point out that the Ally does have a great screen with adaptive sync, so even stable 40 FPS look really fluid and smooth, so keep that in mind. But spoiler up front, I have to admit that I was a bit disappointed in some games, as I have recently tested 50 games on the almost identical RX 780M in a laptop with a Ryzen 9 7940HS with slower 5600 MHz RAM, and I was assuming that the Ally could keep up due to its faster 6400 MHz LPDDR5 RAM. And then again, I was using 32 GB in the laptop and the Ally only provides 16 GB, which is actually already too small in newer and more demanding titles, considering a part of these 16 GB are being used as VRAM. I was trying to mostly use settings that I personally would prefer if I actually played these games on the ROG Ally. And some of these games I probably wouldn't bother playing without a mouse and an external monitor. But I've still tested them, as this might be of interest to some of you, I guess. Okay, without further ado, let's just jump right into today's first game.
In Cyberpunk 2077, I was actually using 1080p at low settings with FSR on performance mode, which in my humble opinion is looking still great on the pretty small 7-inch screen of the ROG Ally. I saw a playable average of 46 with a rather low 1% low FPS of 24. Now, as I often get the question what the 1% low means, let me try to quickly explain them to you. If the 1% low is significantly slower than the average FPS, in short that means that there are quite a big amount of frame drops or stuttering in a game. You can also see these stutters in form of little spikes on the so-called frame time graph on the left side over here. And to be honest, in Cyberpunk 2077 the experience wasn't that great. But many of you probably aren't that sensitive to that and won't really notice it. But if you are, Cyberpunk 2077 isn't the best game to play on the Ally, in my opinion. In Forza 5, I was using the medium preset at 1080p with FSR on performance mode once again, and saw a very playable average of 73 FPS with a good 1% low of 54 FPS. And Forza 5 is probably one of the best games you can play on an Ally, I guess. At least if you're into racing games of any kind. It just looks pretty good and the overall experience is almost flawless, even on a 7-inch screen. Microsoft Flight Simulator is quite playable on the ROG Ally with medium settings at 720p with around 36 FPS on average and a 1% low of 22, which isn't actually that important in this rather slow-paced game where you seldom need to move around very quickly. In my opinion, it's another game that makes sense on the ROG Ally as there aren't too many small details and you can just enjoy the full picture of the screen most of the time. I was using mouse and keyboard to test Apex Legends at 720p and low settings to achieve a pretty high average of 114 FPS and a 1% low of 69. I can't actually tell you too much about this game as I personally don't play it, but I guess most people would be quite satisfied with it. Be aware that this is one of the mentioned examples where the recorded gameplay shows lower FPS than I actually got without using the capture card. In Battlefield 2042, I was once more using the low preset at 720p with mouse and keyboard and saw an average of around 54 FPS and a not so very good 1% low FPS of only 22, which means stutter galore. In a game like that, you'd really want more stable frame times, but I guess that something is bottlenecking in this case. According to the numbers here, it wasn't even the RAM size as the total combined usage seemed to be at only around 10 GB. City Skylines was demanded by the community, and at 720p and low settings I saw 32 FPS on average and a very low 1% low of only 11 FPS, which, to be fair, doesn't matter in a simulation building game like City Skylines. I guess it's playable just fine, though I was actually expecting a better performance. God of War was delivering one of the better experiences, and on 1080p with FSR in performance mode I saw a decent 50 FPS on average and an okay 1% low of 34 FPS. The game still looks pretty good on the 7-inch screen and it actually feels pretty nice. I think I would definitely play the game on this device if I was using it myself. And it doesn't really matter if you use 720p as a native resolution or 1080p and FSR performance. The FPS will be around the same in most games. In GTA 5 I was expecting high FPS at 720p with high settings and wasn't disappointed with 78 FPS on average and a 1% low of around 50 FPS. Though this game can really run on anything these days, even the high settings couldn't impress the ROG Ally. Though I have to point out it looks really good on the integrated screen. Perfectly playable, so let's just have a look at the next game right away. I was testing War Thunder due to demand in the community on the maximum settings at 1080p, which resulted in high 105 FPS on average and a 1% low of 60 FPS. I don't have any experience in testing this title, so I can't really tell you if that is any good at all. But I guess it's more than perfectly playable. So, again, let's have a look at the next game instead. I was testing F1 2022 on medium settings with FSR in performance mode at 1080p and saw an average of 83 FPS with a rather underwhelming 39 FPS 1% low. So there were some stutters as you can see here, though I think driving on a course for a longer time might actually reduce the stutters quite a bit. It seemed playable to me overall despite the few dips here and there. Resident Evil 2 really surprised me at 1080p with balanced settings and FSR on balanced mode with a super high average FPS of 100 and great 73 FPS for the 1% lows. I didn't know what to expect, but that game surely ran pretty good on the ROG Ally. Once more, I would absolutely play it on this device. Perfectly playable in my opinion. The developers really should be proud of themselves, I guess. Call of Duty Warzone 2 didn't run that great at 1080p using the simple preset plus FSR on performance mode with 57 FPS on average and a really bad 1% low of only 17 FPS, which was caused by severe stuttering every few seconds. And you really don't want heavy stutters and freezes in a multiplayer shooter, right? So if Warzone is on your list of favorite games to play on the Ally, make sure to check out first if you can further optimize it somehow, or maybe driver updates will help in the future. But to be honest, I actually think that it's the RAM. We can't really see it here in the OSD, but from my experience, you really need 16 GB of free RAM, and since the Ally is using some of the RAM as VRAM, I guess that's a problem here. The Witcher 3 Next Gen Edition was quite playable at 1080p using the medium preset and FSR on performance with an average of 47 and a 1% low of 33 FPS. Another title that I would definitely play on the Ally, considering it's running better and looks better than on the Nintendo Switch. I just wished this next-gen update would never have happened, as it really affected the performance, while the visual improvement was pretty minor in my opinion. In Rocket League, I was using 1080p and medium settings, which resulted in very high average FPS of 146, but not so good 69 FPS 1% low in comparison, though the stuttering wasn't that bad to be fair. I would call this absolutely playable of course, but I'm really wondering why the 1% low weren't any better, as this game usually isn't that demanding. So maybe further driver updates could help in that case. I was once more using mouse and a keyboard for CSGO of course, and at 1080p with medium settings I saw a decent average FPS of 128 with a 1% low of 61 FPS. This is probably one of the games you wouldn't play directly on the ROG Ally without using a mouse and keyboard, I'd assume. If you think otherwise, please let me know in the comments if you'd actually play it on the device without any peripherals. Elden Ring didn't manage to hit 60 FPS on medium settings at 720p, though I'd still prefer medium settings as the low settings really are too blurry for my taste. 47 FPS on average and 29 for the 1% low is what I saw, and thanks to the adaptive sync screen it still feels fluid enough to enjoy the game, and I would probably play it that way. Hogwarts Legacy was a bit complicated. At first I was testing it at medium settings with 1080p and FSR on performance mode and saw an average of around 29 FPS and a terrible 1% low of 7. Then I switched the ROG Ally's VRAM size to auto, because otherwise the game somehow would not run the shader caching in the beginning, which makes it more or less unplayable. And then on low settings at 720p with the VRAM on auto, it actually scored 61 FPS on average and 28 for the 1% low, finally making it playable in a decent way. So definitely a big thanks to ETA Prime for that great tip, as it really took some time to finally get it to run that way. I was also testing Life is Strange 3 on medium settings at 1080p, which surprised me with great 60 FPS on average and a 1% low of 32 FPS. As Part 3 is the most demanding of the series, you could perfectly enjoy all of these games on the ROG Ally, and they are perfect candidates for the 15 or even the 10 watt mode on battery, while still getting 30 FPS and a much better battery runtime. At 1080p and very low settings, PUBG ran very playable with 107 FPS and a 1% low of 51 FPS. I don't know where that relatively weak 1% low came from though, as the game ran really smooth, without a significant amount of stuttering. Playing the game at 720p isn't the best idea, since actually seeing enemies gets a lot harder that way, especially without any anti-aliasing. For Fortnite I was using low settings and medium textures and the far view distance at 100% resolution at 720p, and that resulted in pretty playable 90 FPS and 1% low of 31, which were caused by seldom stutters like these right here. It was still very playable though, despite the rough edges due to the low resolution. I guess that quite a lot of people will play it on the ASUS ROG Ally, right? Would you? Just let me know in the comments. Assassin's Creed Valhalla ran with around 51 FPS on average and 30 FPS for the 1% low at 720p and medium settings. There were some stutters here and there, but overall it is playable and pretty decent. I'm really curious if the new Assassin's Creed Mirage will run as well on the ROG Ally, but we'll have to wait a while for that game to be released. In FIFA 2023 I was testing 720p and low settings once more and saw an average of around 57 FPS, and the game was perfectly playable overall. But at the cutscenes between the gameplay, they suffered from a terrible frame drop and only ran with about 13 FPS, which isn't an issue for gaming itself, it's just a bit hard to watch and weird. Though another game perfectly playable beside that. In Far Cry 6 I was using 720p and low settings to achieve above 60 FPS on average, so I saw 66 on average and pretty decent 46 for the 1% low, And I guess this is another game that's absolutely playable on this handheld device. And at this point, let me make clear once more that 720p is still looking pretty sharp on this small 7-inch screen. It's really not comparable to a 720p experience on a regular 1080p or laptop display, as the pixel density is still very high. I was also testing Anno 1800 just for fun, as you probably wouldn't play this game on the Ally without a mouse, I guess. But at 1080p medium settings with FSR on ultra quality, I still saw playable 37 FPS on average. The 1% low are hard to measure in this case, as there is always a big stutter when changing the map. For The Division 2 I was testing 1080p with low settings, seeing 69 FPS on average and 39 FPS for the 1% low. The game seemed perfectly playable and I didn't experience any major frame jumps or stutters. But as I don't actually play the game, I couldn't test a lot of scenarios, so I had to rely on the first 2 missions the game has to offer. I hope that's okay. For Red Dead Redemption 2, I was actually using the famous hardware unbox settings at 1080p in combination with FSR and performance, and I was actually impressed by the visual quality while still getting 44 FPS on average and 29 for the 1% low. Despite some seldom stutters, it ran fine, and again, 44 FPS with an adaptive sync monitor is actually really okay. In A Plague Tale Requiem, I also saw an average of 44 FPS and a 1% low of 30 at 720p and low settings. It's playable, absolutely playable once more. It seems like even the more demanding games are at least doable with around 40 FPS or more in any case if you're willing to use 720p and medium or low settings. Redfall was running with a pretty okay average of 48 FPS at 720p and low settings, though the 1% low have been pretty bad with only 15 FPS. And you can see that the frame time graph here on the left is pretty wild, which means the gameplay is quite choppy and not as fluid as it should be. I don't know if something like that will be fixed with future updates or driver optimizations, as the game is relatively new. And Valorant ran perfectly fine at 720p with low settings. I saw 195 FPS on average and 102 for the 1% low. The game ran just fine and I didn't experience any stutters or other issues, though me personally, I probably really couldn't play a fast-paced first-person shooter with thumbsticks, but that's just me, the old PC guy, not used to controllers in shooting games. And yeah, I was actually testing Half-Life Alyx in VR on my Oculus Rift. To do so, I actually dropped the resolution to just above 1000 pixels by around 1000 pixels per eye, and well, it worked somehow. It even actually did hit the maximum 72 FPS of my Oculus Quest from time to time, though the downside clearly is that it's getting kinda blurry on that lower resolution and that it still stutters. But the fact that it's actually running is kind of funny. I was also testing some emulation with CEMU, and both Super Mario Kart and Super Mario 3D World ran perfectly fine with a 1080p graphics mod at stable 60 FPS. So that's kinda cool, as they are perfectly optimized for handheld gaming in my opinion. I would definitely play them on the ASUS ROG Ally for sure. Oh, and I was also quickly testing PS3 emulation with RPCS3 and fired up Dead Space 2, which seemed to run perfectly fine with stable 30 FPS and above, as you can see here. So I guess that emulation is absolutely possible with the ROG Ally. And now let's finally have a look at some more work and casual related benchmarks. I was testing the ROG Ally in all 3 modes plugged in and on battery in PCMark 10. And the results were really amazing. The difference has been pretty small or even non-existent between the turbo and the performance mode. Plugged in, the Ally actually scored around 6,800 points, which is absolutely comparable to a pretty beefy gaming laptop in 2023 or a higher-end desktop PC. And even on battery, the results were amazing and even better than most laptops on battery. That means that everyday tasks, office work, watching YouTube, loading and saving stuff, zipping, browsing, etc. will be more than perfect. In Cinebench R23, the AMD Z1 Extreme CPU was really able to show its muscles and scored up to 14,648 points in the first run, which is basically as fast as a Ryzen 7 5700X, and the single core score is even more impressive with around 1,800 points. In Blender, I was rendering the classroom file and saw the following results. Unfortunately, Blender is yet unable to make use of the integrated GPU and can only render on the CPU. But using it is still possible to some extent though, as it is such a fast CPU and denoising changed a lot in the last few years. And in the new budget Adobe Premiere Pro benchmark, I got up to 245 points and also added some results from other systems as well. As you can see, it's surely not a 4K editing machine, but you could actually use the Ally with Premiere Pro for some basic editing in Full HD for sure. And last but not least, here are the 3D Mark Firestrike results and the 3D Mark TimeSpy results.
Alrighty, that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed the content, please like and consider subscribing to the channel for more laptop and iGPU benchmarks and reviews. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye bye and cheers.